Let's rock!
My lord?
Go f yourself!
Awesome. Very awesome. At the beginning of the second recording, going to start with the Emperor from Robot Chicken saying, go F yourself. All right. So, again, to preface this for people watching on YouTube, we split the episode on 3/5/2022 into 2/3 French Revolution and then into a conversation about Ukraine. This episode serves as the conversation on Ukraine as a distinct entity. Those of you that hung out on Twitch through the BRB, thank you very much. We're not going to change the topic list at the bottom. Slava, Ukraini is still the last topic of the night, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. This conversation will go as long as the people in chat wish it to go. I want to do a few things. I want to talk about some of the things that are in the media right now with respect to what should and should not be done. And I want to talk about the mindsets of people who are saying this or that should be done or not be done. But I think it's important to understand how we got here, right? And we start, and this is going to be more freewheeling. I don't have any notes for this. This is all from memory, from my understanding of history and current events and my own personal experience. We're going to start up here. This is the Russian Empire. In 1914, on the verge of the First World War. This is Tsarist Russia, still under the Tsar system. Tsar, by the way, means Caesar, for those that you don't know that. You will see that the territory that comprised the Russian Empire at the outbreak of World War I, completely composed of modern-day Ukraine. You can see Kiev right there in the middle, or Kiev, as it is correctly pronounced in Ukrainian. Poland's in there. All of the Baltic states are in there. Finland is in there. It is this idea, this notion of what the Russian Empire was, that serves as a basis point for what the Soviet Union became in 1918, and also for a basis of the Cold War with NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Yeah, I didn't realize that Finland was a part of the empire. The other thing that's important to realize about, let's go back before the Russian Empire, the Rus people. The Rus people that sit in these cities that border the Baltic Seas, they formerly served as a buffer into Eastern Europe. When the Mongols came across the steppe, it was the Rus people who stopped them. Not in the mentality of we want to protect a united Europe or anything, but they were the buffer. They were very much on the side of Europe way back. But as the Tsars became the Tsars, this is what the Russian Empire looked like at the beginning of the 20th century, before the end of the First World War came. And as a part of that, the Soviet or Bolshevik Revolution. Bolshevik, by the way, means the majority. And it's actually interesting because Mensheviks outnumbered the Bolsheviks. It was a savvy political naming system constructed by Lenin. But it does give context as to why. Yeah, because Vladimir Putin has very much in his mind this concept of a return to not the Soviet Union, but a Russian imperial concept of Russia, which includes these areas. So you can see why from his perspective, from this historical context, that Ukraine is not, as he says, an independent nation. Now, of course it is, right? Ukraine is an independent sovereign nation, full stop. Because this is not what Europe looks like anymore. It's what it used to look like. But after World War II, so the Soviet Union comes along, Russia doesn't finish the First World War with the rest of the Allies. The Eastern Front collapses, and they have their own problems for a few years as they try to sort things out. By the way, the term Soviet, anyone know what that means? Anyone know what the idea of a Soviet is in terms of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? Okay, so what a Soviet is imagine we have the concept of labor unions, right? Which are, organized blocks of people by industry or by employer, and they collectively bargain, right? That's the idea of a Western American, Western European labor union. That is the kind of cousin of what a Soviet is. in the lead up to the Russian Revolution of October 1918 or 1917, the Soviets were organized, but they were not organized by industry and they were not organized by employer. They were organized geographically. They were workers' associations that sought to do what the Communist Manifesto said to do: gain control of the means of production from the capitalist, money makers that were oppressing them. So Soviets were regionalized workers' unions that also happened to have elements of French street fighting forces, because they knew that they were going to have to fight a war. And the whole concept of Bolsheviks and Mensheviks is simply about the philosophy, about how that war would be fought. But Soviets are regional, large-scale efforts to organize not unskilled laborers, but skilled laborers. Now y'all know where it comes from, in a 2-minute form of what a Soviet is. But the Soviet Union comes along at the end of the First World War effectively, and then it fights its massive fight with Germany in World War II. Right? The Western Front, and how Western history likes to portray what happened in World War II, is that, the United States swung in and saved the day. I really think that at the end of the day, even if we hadn't landed at Normandy, Germany loses. And we'll get into why when we get to World War II. But the Russian-German fight on the Eastern Front is unprecedented. It was millions, tens of millions of committed soldiers dying, fighting into and then back out of Russia. Yeah, stick around to learn more, coming 2031. But at the end of it, right? At the end of World War II, which is where we start to care about this whole geographic makeup again, this is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, you can also draw a line in the middle of Germany, right? Because East Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union as well. And then they had a bunch of puppet states. This was the actual Soviet Union, the red shaded areas. But Poland, the Czech Republic, East Germany, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, a lot of the Baltic states, they were all satellite states under the rule of the Soviet Union. That's what they used to call the Iron Curtain, for those of you that didn't grow up.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
And yes, Poland was, by literal definition, for example, an independent country. Its government was puppeted by Moscow. So you could take this border, and I'm going to draw this fairly ad hoc, so please don't criticize me in the comments later, but you could draw this border and say, yeah, this is really the border of what realistically the Iron Curtain looked like, right? And then add in half of Germany. This is the world I grew up in. I was born in 1977. This political reality is what I was born into. I was raised in the Cold War. I was raised under the understanding that there were nuclear weapons in Russia and the United States, and it was a bad detection away from a full-blown nuclear war. But this is Europe. Effectively from 1945 until 1991, when the Berlin Wall falls, actually 89 when the Berlin Wall falls, and then 91 when the Soviet Union breaks up. And that, I'll erase that one because I didn't want to draw there. I wanted to drag it, and I hate when I do that. That is what this looks like. This is the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. So Russia's still massive, right? But you have the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania breaking away. Ukraine breaks away. Poland breaks away. Most of the Iron Curtain all breaks away into independent states. Georgia, they all go their own way. Kazakhstan, they all become their own countries. Ukraine becomes its own country. And that, for the purposes of the modern conversation about what's happening in Ukraine, is what matters. They are independent. What's also interesting is we'll go back over to this map for just a second, you'll notice this little piece of territory called Kaliningrad right here. Kaliningrad is actually still part of Russia today. So it's land. There's no land bridge to Kaliningrad from Russia proper. It's kind of like Hawaii. They have to go through the Baltic Sea to get things there. I don't know, everybody else decided to deny their airspace to it. Richie was in second grade and the wall came down. I remember one of the kids in my class went after the wall, came down and brought back a chunk of it with him. Yeah, I remember that there was the opportunity to purchase pieces of the Berlin Wall, but I didn't understand its ramifications at the time. Now I do. But the Berlin Wall effectively split Berlin in half between a Western democracy-controlled zone and an Eastern Soviet Union-controlled zone, and the Western zone was isolated because it was encircled by East Germany. So the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 leads to all these countries which, for a long time, prior and into Tsarist Russia, have not been independent countries. We've talked about how Poland wasn't really an independent country again until after the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I. So all these nations that comprised this Tsarist concept of Russia, they intermingled. What is a Ukrainian and a Pole and a Lithuanian and a Latvian culturally intermingled with the Russians. So that's why you have in Ukraine now these separatist-controlled areas which are leaning Russian because they're predominantly Russian culturally. And it's the really flimsy pretext for why Vladimir Putin has said, let's go in there to support them. And then 2 days later was, let's just roll through Ukraine, which didn't work out as well as he wanted. That's why Ukraine is seen differently between the East and the West. Because the East, Russia, has this, especially Vladimir Putin, he has this Soviet Union / Tsarist Russia concept of what Ukraine was. Just another piece of land within what is Russia, or the Soviet Union. Toofy says, Putin is the worst Hearts of Iron 4 player I've ever seen. So, how did we get here, though, right? You should understand at least now the Eastern concept of this. Why does Putin, in his warped mind, think that Ukraine should be just part, it's not really a country and should just be part of Russia? It's because of this history. It's because from the perspective on his side, his own perspective is, that's the way it was a long time ago. But the Cold War. In the aftermath of World War II, after everyone involved realized that the Soviet Union wasn't going to be the ally they had all hoped it would be. Basically, the Soviet Union was an ally of convenience. Winston Churchill famously said that he would support Russia simply because they were the enemy of Germany after Germany drove into Russia. And he really didn't look past that in terms of who he was giving support to at the time, because his own nation's survival depended upon it. It's honestly what I struggle to answer. I get historical. This was Russia. It should be Russia now. I'm going to make it Russian again. I just don't get why now. Well, we can get into that as well. And it'll be a political conversation, but we can get into that. Remind me of the question, because I want to get us to that precipice first, Gilly. But in the aftermath of World War II, the West, the Western democracy, said, Russia's pretty big, and they've effectively drawn a line. You'll notice that this line at Germany is effectively the line at which the Russians reached during the Second World War, because they took Berlin. They were just conquering territory the whole way there and then never gave it back. And when the Western democracy looked at that and said, that's a problem, they developed what was known as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So we're going to take a look at NATO and NATO expansion. Hey, let's see a little piece of Paris down there. But NATO, in 1949, was the dark-colored nations. Portugal, France, Great Britain, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark. West Germany would join in 1952, and then East Germany would join in 1982. Actually, no, sorry. 1952 to 1982. East Germany wouldn't join until after the Berlin Wall fell, when it was a reorganized country. But you can see that there's this slow march. There's a slow march of NATO expansion east, where, now Poland's in there, and now a lot of the Balkans, and now territories which border Russia directly. And the Baltic states are a part of NATO. Not only Vladimir Putin, but other Russian leaders have had a problem with what they term to be NATO's eastward expansion. Yep, Latvia and Estonia actually touch Russian soil. So would Ukraine if Ukraine were made a NATO member. Now, Ukraine wants to be a NATO member now, and NATO has what's called an open door membership policy, which means anybody who wants to join NATO can join NATO, provided they can meet the 2% GDP requirement of funding their own national defense. Now, many NATO countries don't reach this. They don't reach that threshold. Germany just recommitted to it, by the way. But the idea of NATO is that there's a thing in the charter, and it's also at times called the American Treaty. Well, Soviet Union, yes. Correct me if I'm wrong, but NATO was formed as a defense pact against Soviet Union primarily. That's correct. The idea here is that if any one nation, and you have to remember at the time that when NATO was originally being formed, that like this was the line, right? That this right here was the line. Yeah. Toofy, we try not to get too far ahead with what we talk about in chat. Let me get there. But I know you haven't hung out in chat for one of these episodes before. But there's a thing in the way this is built called Article 5, as Toofy just said in chat, where if any one member nation is attacked, they can invoke Article 5 and all the other nations will come to their defense. It's effectively the same type of intertangling treaty that kicked off World War I to a degree, where you have a treaty obligation to defend someone else. It's no longer an attack on your own sovereign soil you have to worry about, but should a NATO member be attacked and Article 5 is invoked, the defense forces stood up and they go to war. This is hugely important right now for what is going on in Ukraine, by the way. Yeah, you attack one of us, you attack all of us. That is the philosophy. Because none of these nations in NATO, including the United States, are as large as the Soviet Union was and Russia is. There was the need for a cooperational alliance system in order to be able to say, we can do something if you do something. Now, the other piece of this is the European Union. And I did it again. I drew on that again. The European Union, which does not include United Kingdom anymore, but the European Union is an economic zone, right? An economic and trade zone where effectively its member states can pretty much freely trade with each other. There's no passport needed, etc. The United Kingdom is no longer in there thanks to Brexit. And Norway is only a member of the Free Trade Association. It's not actually a member of the EU proper. So think about this. Over the evolution of the democratic West, you have a military treaty organization and you have an economic and trade organization, all pushing further and further east toward the Russian Federation. It does present a threat to Russia, because Russia's not a member of either, and both organizations, more NATO, but the EU too, is designed to give economic military stability to a region of otherwise independent sovereign states geographically. So we roll up to 2014 when Russia, the green block of the map just says Switzerland. Switzerland, by the way, has been neutral pretty much since the Franco-Prussian War, and now they're not all of a sudden, not economically anyway. But we roll up to 2014 in this area called the Crimea, which borders the Black Sea. Again, using the logic of it should be part of Russia, the Crimea was annexed by Russia, recognized by virtually nobody as Russian territory in 2014. What this did in Ukraine was it caused the Ukrainian government to swing very pro-democratic, pro-West, because what were they going to do if Russia invaded. The other thing that happened after the Crimea was annexed in 2014 is, well, two things. One, the world in the United States responded to Russia economically. And the sanctions that were put in place on Russia caused the value of the ruble compared to the dollar to plunge. Not as bad as it's plunged right now, but plunge pretty badly. But the government in Ukraine said, this is probably a matter of time before Russia does something else. And they were right. But what they've done over the past, 8 years is establish a pretty robust urban defense force. Very organized, very good at what they're doing. It has been proven in the last 2 weeks. So as Russia tried to roll into Ukraine, the Ukrainians were ready for that first thrust, and especially in the way that the Russians tried to do it. And that's how we get here, is that there is a historical bias on behalf of I would term a lunatic in charge of Russia, who is telling his own people that the justification for entering Ukraine and taking it over is because there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine. He's hearkening back to historical ties and saying we should go into Ukraine and rid them of their Nazi problem, just like we did before, and in turn take it over. But the real reason he doesn't want anybody, he wants Ukraine, is so that Ukraine can't join NATO. Ukraine joining NATO would put another, we'll get into propaganda in a second, but Ukraine joining NATO would put another huge block of territory on the edge touching Russian soil that would pose another strategic risk to Russia. So before that can happen, one of the things that Vladimir Putin has said repetitively is he wants Ukraine to guarantee their neutrality. He wants Ukraine to basically say, we won't join NATO. And basically surround Belarus as well, which is a independent country, which is effectively turned into a Russian puppet state. If you're looking for that one, we'll go over here, because that's where Belarus is. Yeah, it's a puppet state. So Russia is trying to determine the destiny of another country because they don't like where the country was going. They don't like the fact that...
Well, it's about tree fitting.
They don't like the fact that a Crimean annexation in 2014 caused Ukraine to lean further to the west and in turn make them more likely to join the NATO's alliance. Finland, by the way, is also now talking about joining NATO, which would put another country on Russia's touching edge that is a part of NATO. But the notion of why this invasion has happened is rooted very much in that. Historical, used to be part of Russia, cultural intermingling that occurred 150 years ago and before, and the idea that the further NATO expands to the east, the more pressure Russia feels that they're under strategically. Did they not expect Ukraine to react that way after they annexed Crimea? I don't know. I think that it's rooted in this. They attempt to annex the Crimea in 2014, and they've done so from a physical perspective, even though it's not viewed that way legally. And the world reacts with sanctions, which they should do. I think that's where you pivot to what happened in 2016, where the next step for Russia was to begin to undermined the integrity of Western democratic institutions. We all know and accept this fact, because it's true, that Russia directly interfered in the elections that produced Donald Trump as our president. And what did Donald Trump do? Well, he sure as hell pulled money out of Ukraine and tried to blackmail their leadership in order to serve his own political ends. If you don't think that that was at the behest of some agenda that was being piped into his ear with respect to what is going down right now, you're insane. When Crimea was annexed and Russia saw the Putin, I don't want to categorize this all as Russia. When Putin saw the reaction of the world, he knew he couldn't take another step. He needed to start undercutting the pillars fundamentally. That's why you saw Brexit happen. I believe very firmly that there was an Eastern influence in causing Brexit to occur. But definitely in our own elections in the United States. It is funny how it all ties together, if Doofies aren't wrong. When you look at how those influences were timed to put effectively a person who was not qualified for the job. I'm not going to disparage the man personally. He did not possess the faculties or the morality to be the president of the United States, and he only served his own interests and not the interests of the nation. That's a factual statement. But the purpose over the last 4 years under a Boris Johnson, Donald Trump-led West was destabilize that West, so that when a further military move was made by Russia westward, the West would be in no shape to do anything about it. That was the idea. Break NATO's strong bonds, break the EU's strong bonds, so that when we go to do something else, they are in not as strong of a position to oppose us as they were when they sanctioned us pretty uniformly when we took Crimea. And so we get to this past, 6 months where it became very obvious. Yeah, also Trump wanted to get us out of NATO too. Weird. For the past 6 months, Russia began to mass troops in Ukraine, and the Belarusian forces did the same thing, and it became very obvious that there was going to be an invasion of Ukraine. And I think the world could have done more in advance of it to signal where things were going to go for Russia in real terms before they did it. Maybe actually do some things to say, hey, pull back. But at the end of the day, 2 weeks ago, they actually rolled into Ukraine. And the fighting's the fighting. I mean, we could talk about the individual things that have happened, like, a nuclear power plant being shelled, which was extremely dangerous. But what I want to talk about is there are a lot of people. Basically, any questions on all this? This is a quick hit, right? It's a 30-minute primer on how we got here. How we got to Russia believing they could get away with invading Ukraine. The T-32 being a Russian tank, for Tufi's reference, that was notoriously poor. Okay, so what has been in front of us since the Ukrainian invasion? Do you have an answer to the why now more specific than you've already laid out? Why now? Ukraine is... The why now, I think, is more rooted in the fact that look at where Joe Biden was as a president rolling into this year. Historically low polling numbers. We're coming off of 1 year since Donald Trump was, ousted as president of the United States. Boris Johnson still in as the leader of the United Kingdom from a parliamentary perspective. I think it was why now because it couldn't be a year from now. I think that as the world pivots away, the Western world pivots away from a nationalist concept of operating their countries, as Donald Trump wanted us to do, there was an ever-increasing risk that an attempt at Ukraine would have further diminishing returns. You don't mean to be a cynic here, but you see the U.S. itself as being weaker a year from now? I absolutely disagree with that statement. Because a year ago, the rest of the world, whom we are allied with, could not take us seriously. There was no trust in the value of what the U.S. saying it would do being done. There was a despot in charge of the executive branch, at least in what Joe Biden is as president. When he commits to something, you do realize it comes from at least a background of understanding what those commitments mean. The allies in NATO surely understand that. So I don't know. I think economically we may be weaker thanks to inflation, but militarily and with respect to our European alliances, we're surely not. And that was all proven, by the way, in the last 2 weeks, because when you see QAnon branch taking a branch of government midterm, but you'll put that away. That's a domestic policy problem, and I think you can see the QAnon branch of whatever right-wing government is currently attempting, right-wing party that's currently attempting to do whatever they're going to do in the United States. I equate QAnon to kind of like the Tea Party to a degree, where the Tea Party thought they were going to take over the Republican Party. And at the end of the day, I start to see Donald Trump more and more, which is really what the QAnon base is rooted in, as more of an annoying hair on the arm of the Republican Party that eventually is going to get flicked off because the candidates he's backing in primaries are losing. So I'm not so sure that we're going to see a branch. But yeah, the point being is that the why now is the perception from Putin's chair, regardless of what your perception or my perception is that with his proxy out of power in the U.S. and the U.S. kind of, at least for a couple of years, coming to its senses, it was a now is the best time because tomorrow's a worst time proposition in Ukraine. Ukraine historically is a massive breadbasket for Europe. One of the reasons Hitler wanted it is because it could produce food for Lebensraum, for the German expansion of its peoples east. And they were going to kill everybody in Ukraine. But it is a massive grain producer. It exports grain to Russia. It exports grain to Pakistan. It exports grain everywhere because it grows a lot of grain. But it was a now or never proposition for Putin to go into the Ukraine because his position was weakening day by day from his perspective. Do you think Putin will be using the nuclear power plants as a weapon to help take Ukraine, cripple the infrastructure, and make them surrender? I think that's too vague of a question. How do you use nuclear power plants as a weapon except to destabilize them? I think the staff that are still necessary to run them will scram those reactors before they allow meltdowns. Chernobyl is what Gorbachev attributed as a primary reason to the U.S. No, that's not the reason the Soviet Union failed. The Soviet Union was a failing state for at least 15 years before that. Economically, domestically, there was literal starvation. It was that Gorbachev saying Chernobyl was the reason the Soviet Union failed is it's a convenient cop out. But there was actually a palace coup attempt that failed as well. It just wasn't as organized as it needed to be, or it didn't have the necessary will that it needed to have in order to topple the Soviet Union. There was plenty of domestic unrest outside of Chernobyl. Yeah, they were bankrupt and their states were pulling away. It's a great way for Tufi's phrase it. They were well on their way to break up before Chernobyl, and Chernobyl was not the catalyzing reason for the breakdown of the Soviet Union. But apart from Manny's question, apart from using the nuclear power plants as a weapon, I don't think so. I'll get into some of the scenarios that I think are plausible outside of how do you weaponize a nuclear power plant apart from melting it down. Modern nuclear reactors and the crews that are there that they need to run them that are effectively being held hostage there. They can't be nuclear bombs. The waste material and the fissile material can be used, but Russia doesn't need to capture nuclear material from Ukrainian power plants. They've got the largest supply of nuclear missiles in the world. So I think the why now is because he wants Ukraine, and tomorrow is a worse day than today, based on the way in which the economic and military climates of Western democracies have trended in the last year and a half. And it does stem for him from why Ukraine. That question stems for him from it should be part of Russia, right? That's his philosophy. It's his stated public philosophy. He's also convinced the Russian people that the West and the Ukraine are the aggressors here. I have some friends, and I'll leave it at that are Russian that live here who are in a struggle right now with their families back in Russia proper to convince them that they're being lied to, because the state media apparatus has them completely convinced that Vladimir Putin's war is justified. Now, obviously not all of them, right? Because there's plenty of people demonstrating in the streets of 40 Russian cities. There's a lot of people that are just like, well, of course we should have done this. We have to stop exactly what our leader is telling us is going on there. But why sanctions? Why?
Remember to clonk that follow button.
Why are sanctions a good thing? You're referring to shutting them down, killing the country of power, using it against the people. Manny, when you blow up a city with an artillery strike, it doesn't really matter if the building has power if it's not there anymore, right? I don't think so. I don't think turning the power off is going to make a difference. Yeah, there was a law passed about independent journalism. The BBC shut down all their operations in Ukraine because of it, because their reporters could be jailed over it. But the reaction, right? The first reaction to what happened in Ukraine was sanctions. And everyone was like, oh, it's not enough. I think the important thing to understand about sanctions is that they were never going to stop a tank from rolling. into Ukraine, right? They were never going to stop the first 100 tanks from rolling. What they're going to stop is the next 6,000 tanks from being produced. And I want to explain why, they'll stop a tank from being built. The reason why sanctions are important is this. When you do what is unprecedented, what the West has done to Russia, Russia has a currency called the ruble. And any currency is rooted in one concept: the trust that the people who possess it have in that the value the state says it has will be respected. So when you walk around with $20 in your pocket, you're sure that this is worth $20. When someone walks around with 80 rubles in their pocket, 2 weeks ago, they were pretty sure that was worth $1. Now, when they walk around with 80 rubles in their pocket, it's not even worth 0.8 of a penny. Why is this important? Now, it didn't cause bread prices to skyrocket in Russia yet, but what it did do was this. When Russia wants to conduct business to buy parts, components, materiel that they cannot make themselves, they have to conduct that business financially. Well, if they cannot guarantee the people that they're doing business with that the value of the currency of that exchange is worth something, they cannot do business. Now, you've heard about this war chest, this billions of dollars that Vladimir Putin supposedly had stored ready for this fight, right? The problem with that is almost half of it or more was stored in currencies that were not the ruble. They were stored in euros primarily, and then dollars. Well, now he can't access that money. So what he cannot do is take money that he had stored, put it into his own banking institutions because he can't access that money, and therefore maintain the value of the ruble. And this is how he would have done that. If Vladimir Putin had access to $360 billion, and that's just a number thrown out there, he could have entered into an agreement or created banks to enter into agreements with each other that were not affected by this swift pullout that effectively said, yes, for the time being, I will buy rubles from you at a value of 80 rubles equals $1. And regardless of sanctions, when two institutions conduct volume exchange of currency like that, 80 rubles is worth $1. It doesn't matter what sanctions do, because as long as the banking institutions can maintain that exchange rate with capital stored elsewhere by Vladimir Putin, the value of the ruble can remain stable. And in turn, he can conduct business based on the value of that ruble with parties outside Russia. But right now, he cannot go to... No, he can't even do it now, Rex. He can't even do it now because the amount of assets that have been frozen and the removal of Russian banks from the Belgian-based SWIFT international banking system have ensured he cannot do that. He cannot create interchange actions within his own economy where he can set the value of his currency because he doesn't have the capital to do it. And that is what sanctions are doing to him. If he cannot do that, then he cannot build more tanks. And that's why sanctions do what they do. Now, sanctions of this scale are unheard of in history. The degree to which the financial system of Russia has been attacked is unprecedented. The removal of banking institutions from SWIFT is something SWIFT didn't even want to do. The SWIFT institution itself was like, we don't want to be used as a political entity. But everybody else is like, you pull out or we're pulling out. Yeah, we have turned and isolated Russia economically in a way that North Korea is isolated, and then some. But the idea of that ability to maintain currency value, that is the primary aim of all of these banking sanctions. Make it so that he cannot shore up his currency on his own because he cannot reach the assets he needs because they're stored outside of Russia in order to conduct the transactions necessary to effectively falsify the value of his currency. Did Italy finally join in? I don't know. Yeah, he can't stabilize his own currency via use of one of ours. And there's a lot of conversation about, well, he's divested himself. No, they've reduced their debt by almost a third since they invaded Crimea, which is something. But they've also heavily leaned into gold. You can't conduct transactions straight in gold. It doesn't work that way. You have to convert gold to currency and then exchange currency to currency. Without the SWIFT banking system, he can't take the mountain of gold he has and translate it to a usable currency. If he translates it to rubles, it's worth nothing. So a war of attrition is not in Russia's best interest. Correct. They need this to be over quickly. Because semiconductor, all manner of material embargoes have been part of this sanctions process. On top of this economic crippling of the value of the ruble and the inability to revalue the ruble artificially. So all of this has occurred in order to make sure that the longer Russia goes, the worse it's going to get for them as a nation. There's only so long that they can hold out under these conditions and still, keep the lights on. And it's probably not that long. So where does Putin get his money from? This is a conversation that I've been barking about on Twitter, but you hear the term oligarchs. There are a lot of Russian billionaires out there. There's actually, and I've heard reporting on this, that there has been basically an understood agreement that as long as they support Putin, Putin will not come down on any of them for any of their criminal activity, and in turn, Putin gets about half of what they make. So if Ukraine were to fall, these sanctions would still stay in place. Yes, for sure. Hypothetically, for sure. I don't see the sanctions falling until Russia has pulled out of Ukraine and Ukraine's government is reestablished. And I would go so far as to say there's probably going to be a movement for some form of reparations at the end of all this. But that's if there is an end to all of this, right? Two things. Well, a couple things. But the two things that have been mentioned that are really dumb from people who don't have an understanding of the basis of all of this. I think the power of capitalism will become a bargain eventually. Russian money can still cycle through our systems, and certainly companies have to rely on it. I don't think so. The number of businesses who have done business in rubles since 2014 is significantly lower than it was prior to that, and I don't think that capitalism is eventually going to chip away at the sanctions. Now, you're fine. Ask the questions. That's why we're doing this. I don't think capitalism is going to overcome what has been done. I don't think that there's eventually going to be some block of lobbying that gets in there and says, oh, you know what, we really want to do business with Russia again, regardless of what's going on in Ukraine. That's really a PR disaster if that comes out. Yeah, there's more of a lean toward how quickly can we divest ourselves of reliance upon Russian Russian exports. That really is where it's leaning right now. Yeah, companies like the Trump Organization. But the two asinine things that I've heard repetitively on every social media outlet and a lot of really dumb websites is, first, let's emergency induct Ukraine into NATO. Gas prices are going to run up. I would say that that's a small price to pay to try to protect a free people's ability for self-determination. Yeah. So why do you guys think, now that we've talked through all of this, we understand what Article 5 is, why is emergency induction of Ukraine into NATO a dumb move? Anybody, go ahead and chat. Tell me why you think it's stupid. Or why you think it's great. World War III starts now. It would trigger Article 5. Yes. World War III. Look at that. It took 35, 40 minutes to get to the point where you understand that if Ukraine, who is already being attacked, is admitted to NATO, they will immediately invoke Article 5, and then all those countries, plus the United States and Canada, go to war immediately. What's the problem with that? It'd be the first modern war in history conducted in conventional means where nuclear weapons holders are involved. Oh, bogus. Oh, we would never. Yes, we would. Absolutely, we would. Don't think for a second that we spent a year in the French Revolution examining how desperate people try to hang on to power. You don't think for a second that one of these guys is going to look at one of the other guys and say, well, they wouldn't, but I sure would, and I can get it. I can get ahead of this and try it. It absolutely would happen. There are nuclear weapons involved on both sides. and they would absolutely be launched. It would be the annihilation of the world. We would Stone Age ourselves for whatever population survived. It would be the doomsday scenario that everyone talked about right after nuclear weapons were developed. Yeah, global thermonuclear war. So, now that you know that or we all agree that that's a really dumb idea, we've heard recently that, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has requested a no-fly zone be established over Ukraine by NATO. Why is that a dumb idea? Yeah, mutual assured destruction is what MAD means. World War III Part 2. Yep, same reason. Because even if they're not shooting at each other, right, they're just enforcing a perimeter. Putting assets from NATO countries in that close proximity to Russian assets is a ticking time bomb. Some Russian pilot or some NATO pilot's going to get cocky and they're going to try to, fly close formation on an escort out and maybe touch wingtips, and boom, it's on. The moment there's a single casualty between NATO and Russia inflicted from the other side, it's World War III. And yes, NATO needs to be calculating and not reaction here. And NATO has done some really good things. For instance, Germany, for the first time since the end of World War II, has repealed its laws that prohibit the export of lethal weapons under its control to a war zone. Which means they can start shoving all the anti-tank missiles that they make directly into the Ukraine. It's insane. And add $100 billion to their defense, which is the Pearl Harbor attack, created this concept of you woke the sleeping giant in the United States. What Russia has done here is woke the sleeping economic and military giant that Germany can be. They stood up and said, hey, we thought that thing out to the east was a done deal in 91, and it's not. And apparently we're actually going to have to prepare ourselves and be a deterrent. And that's what they're doing. Weapons cannot invoke Article 5. Yep. You can enter into... Franklin Roosevelt famously said during Lend-Lease, before the United States was in World War II, that when your neighbor's house is on fire, you do not argue over the price of your garden hose. Yeah, as long as we are not the ones shooting the weapon, there is not NATO, you're not sitting there with American flag in a U.S. military uniform or a Canadian military uniform or whatever. You're not over there as an organized, structured force fighting with the Ukrainians against Russia. We're fine. Which means we should be providing as much materiel support as we can to Ukraine. Quite frankly, we should be looking at every aircraft that we have ever thought about retiring that is in an aged fleet and say, hey, you want a bunch of, Block 40 F-16 CJs that are about 20 years old? We'll sell you those $5. $5 a plane. We'll get them over to you. Got to provide the aircrew from somewhere else. But put the plane, and we'll get you all the fuel and munitions you need for them, as long as we aren't the ones flying it or servicing it. We go past that line, though, and it's World War III. I get it, though, right? I get that everybody sees the immediate humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, and it's horrible. I mean, I'm heavily Slavic in my background. I'm Polish, and based on the map that you just saw, I guarantee you I've got Ukrainian blood in my past, too. But it is horrendous what is happening in Ukraine. But doing anything direct is worse. Worse. There's no way you can argue from a point of logic that says if the West became directly involved, if NATO became directly involved, it makes the situation better. Because it won't. It might make you feel better on Twitter. It might make you feel better whenever you're barking at whomever about how frustrated you are with how all of this is going down. But unfortunately, you have to give the moderate economic approach that the West has undertaken time to do its job. And there are lots of people on the ground in Ukraine that are going to suffer because of it. And it sucks for them. But the alternative is far worse. If Belarus, and they know this, if Belarus goes into Ukraine, which they haven't done yet, they will be hit with the same crippling economic plate of sanctions that Russia got. And they know it. And I think they're on a line right now. We're like, oh, Yeah, heard the comment too. This would not have happened if Donald Trump were president. We would have been too divided to do anything about it. This would not have happened? Yes. It would not have happened this way. I think what would have happened is you would have seen an emboldened Russia attempt to push even further further west. I don't think that Putin stops with Ukrainian aspirations right now if Trump is president. I certainly know for a fact that the unified, harsh economic response of the West would not have happened. And understanding the need to ensure currency solvency is at the root of these economic sanctions. There's no way that would have happened under the prior administration. Just none, because it wasn't in his individual self-interest to do it. So we've been going for almost an hour on the Ukraine topic, and that's kind of what I wanted to do. I wanted to talk through it and talk to you and your comments, but what else do you wish to speak to on this before we kind of wrap things up tonight? I wanted to give everybody the outlet. I know there's a lot of conversations happening individually, and I wanted to bring the information together and put it in front of people and allow people to understand why things are being done the way they are and why things like a no-fly zone or NATO admission of Ukraine that shouldn't happen. I've said this publicly. I really, truly, I watched it. I watched an 8-year-old boy who had said goodbye to his dad crying on a bus as a journalism crew had picked him and his mom up, and it tore me because 10 years ago when I was post-divorce and had nothing to my name, I'd be on a plane already. I have the expertise to go do something. They're in as much better shape. But there's literally nothing that we can do in our chairs tonight except inform others from a position of wanting to simply exchange correct information, and if you have the means, to support the individuals in Ukraine right now financially. I only have questions about where this goes, and you're not a fortune teller. I can roll through those. I did fortune tell this a little bit if you want, Gilly. Let me pull this up and drag this over to another window so I can read it from there. I see 4 possible outcomes, and I have no problem going into those 4 possible outcomes. I know some of you read these. Scenario 1. You're welcome, Gilly. Scenario 1 of where this goes. Putin wins militarily, right? He wins militarily in Ukraine. He achieves his political goals of effectively encompassing them and putting in a puppet government. Oppression in Russia increases. Western sanctions intensify, aiming at regime change in Russia. European division from Russia becomes more permanent, meaning they cut their energy ties to Russia. And at this moment, this seems like the most likely scenario. That Russia will likely take control of Ukraine, the West will further isolate Ukraine economically, and Central and Western Europe will cut themselves off economically and from a resource perspective from Russia, isolating them with the idea that, hey, we can get the Russians to do this on our own and get them to topple this government on its own. We don't need to go there and do it. The question becomes, at what cost? Total destruction of Ukraine, probably to a degree. Ukrainian statehood as we know it right now will likely end, because once the Zelensky government's out and guerrilla war starts, because it will, there will be a lurch for power at some point when Russia has to pull back from Ukraine. And the democratic institutions of the last 8 years, maybe not. We'll see where that happens. I think that's the most likely scenario. Scenario 2. Putin realizes that he's in a military stalemate. And I think we were maybe here last week, but aren't so much this week, because he has gone from his plan B, which is let's conduct a war the way Western allies would, and then try to push forward and just shock and awe and take objectives. I don't think it worked because they're not built that way. I think that the Ukrainian government in a stalemate condition would accept some concessions. Zelensky's been under 4 assassination attempts in the last 72 hours. The nice thing is that the FSB, the Russian successor to the KGB, has some dissidents inside of it and keeps telling them where they're coming from. But stalemate happens. Ukraine accepts neutrality and some concessions in order to retain their sovereignty. If the cost becomes too high for Putin, I think he looks for a way out. I think he looks for some way out. If he realizes he's overstretched and cannot sustain this, and I think that's where sanctions come in. If the sanctions can become effective quick enough to where his military operations cannot be sustained, he may seek some sort of settlement. But I think it's less likely. Yeah, which is insane to think about, considering Putin came from the KGB and FSB. I don't know. I think if he doesn't have money, Gilly, and he loses the support of his oligarch buddies, which is slowly happening, it's possible. I didn't say likely, but it's possible. It's a possible outcome. Do I think it will happen? No. But it's within the possibilities. So what would happen at the end of that scenario if there was a stalemate is the fundamental geopolitical conflict between the West and Russia would remain. It would stabilize for now. There would be some sort of split concept of Ukraine at the end of it, maybe. But Ukraine would retain its sovereignty in some form. Yeah, it would be a Berlin Wall scenario. An East Germany, West Germany scenario for sure. Third scenario. Putin loses in Ukraine militarily, which is even less likely. It's forced to retreat with heavy casualties. Maybe. It depends on his material lines, his logistic lines, and how quickly sanctions have an impact on him. The Western sanctions against him probably further cripple his power as they see the opportunity at that point to, he retreated. Let's not let up now. We can get rid of this madman. There would probably at some point be a palace coup attempt under those conditions where there would be for sure an attempt to remove Putin because it's not only Russian people and food and material, but pride at that point that this guy is a failure, and it would be certainly the end of him. So I think he understands that full-out retreat is the end of him. So I don't see that as very likely. I think it's more likely that there would be some sort of palace revolt inside of a victorious Russia under the continuing economic sanctions and pull away of the West. There's no good reason to expect this to happen. There's no good reason to expect liberal democratic ideals to prevail completely in this scenario. I think it's the least likely, maybe second least likely scenario. The last one is, the worst one. Putin is on the brink of losing militarily. It would be fun. You're not wrong. It would be fun. But Putin's on the brink of losing militarily. Like, he sees it. He's not going to get his outcome, whether that means stalemate or whether that means, he's just simply going to have to retreat. And the likelihood of foreign engagement increases where NATO decides, hey, maybe we should get involved, which would be the worst idea ever, leading ultimately to one of two forms of a nuclear exchange. Either Putin dirty bombs the Ukraine or his own people to frame the West for it, or there is a full-blown strategic nuclear exchange. Causes multi-million casualties worldwide if it's not reined in the first salvo. It is the least likely, but it is the possible outcome we could find ourselves in if we don't take the time to think through our actions and act cautiously to ensure that we don't end up there. I think if Putin sees himself directly threatened, it's possible this happens. And it's quite frankly up to the Russian intelligence and military services to stop him at that point. Yeah, let's just hope that there's a case of something. Let's just hope there's somebody with a conscience somewhere in Russia should that order ever come down. Just as we had hoped for 4 years that if Donald Trump had decided that he was, itchy trigger finger on the nuclear button, that there would have been a conscience somewhere. And I think there is. Yeah, I agree with Tufi. If there's already dissidents in the FSB, there's a decent chance that if an order to launch came down, that it would stop. The difference in it is this. The nuclear trident in the United States is represented by land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, aircraft-carried nuclear bombs, and submarines, ballistic missile submarines that they can't find anywhere. Right? And the Russian trident has those things too. The thing that the Russian trident has that we don't have is mobile launchers, which this, and I'll tell you this with respect to the nuclear war. We've heard Vladimir Putin say, upping our nuclear strategic readiness level. You want to know how I knew that was saber rattling and nothing more? Because
remember to clonk that follow button.
Not only that, Perm, thank you very much, but when the order was supposedly given, the strategic resources necessary to carry out an actual nuclear strike were not moved. When you start hearing reports that warheads are being attached to missiles for mobile launchers, then worry, because that didn't happen. When you start hearing things like armaments being moved to airfields for strategic bombers to carry, that's when you get worried. But until the weapons are actually being loaded onto the elements of the Trident proper, from Russia's perspective, Gilly, you have to understand that you can't be white-black about it. Gilly's comment is, I don't want to be all white-black, but saber rattling with nuclear weapons is never acceptable. I agree with that statement. What I'm saying is, what it did was get you to do exactly your response that you're conveying now, where, oh, how dare he even threaten that? That's not the point. The point is, are you really threatened? And that's what I'm trying to elaborate on. No, the threat level did not materially raise after he made that statement. Because the munitions were not attached to their propellant vehicles, and those propellant vehicles were not fueled. The only thing that still exists is a part of the triad that is out there every day. Like, we don't have bombers in the sky right now, right? That would start World War III. Just like they don't have bombers in the sky. So they don't have weapons loaded on the bombers. If they're really thinking about it, those weapons will become part of the Trident. They'll get loaded on, and the West will see it. No, but what you did indicate was that you should worry about the statement as being acceptable, not acceptable, versus the reality of the threat of the statement. And that's where I diverge from you on that. Is I saw him say it, I was like, okay, what's the reality of that statement? Is there actually a threat? Did he take the actions that would be indicative of that threat being levied? And the answer to that question was no. So it's like, okay, I'm in the same position I was yesterday. He's a madman out there doing what he's doing, but he didn't actually elevate his DEFCON by any level that is meaningful for a more probable nuclear exchange. And that's the part I care about. Yeah, to me, it is very much what Tufi said. He wants to rattle his saber. He's been doing that for forever. We cannot trust a word that comes out of the guy, because he sat there for the months prior to the invasion of Ukraine go, no, we're not going to invade Ukraine. We're just ensuring our own borders. And he wasn't saying this to his own people. He was saying this to President of France. We're not going to do anything. You guys are reacting. You're overreacting to what I'm doing. And then he did exactly what we thought he was going to do. So what I would encourage you to do, especially on the nuclear front, now that we've outlined those 4 scenarios, is don't react to the headline. Investigate the headline, because it's important to understand the facts around what is being said versus the attention grabbing that media is attempting to do so that they can get their ad revenue. Rex says, if nukes don't get launched as a result of this, do you think the world will get to a place of having a nuclear weapon banned? Seeing how terrified everyone is of it, will this be a catalyst to global shift on its viewpoint of nukes? I think that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty exists, and I think that as long as nations like Russia and the United States are super powerful, no, you will not see the end of nuclear weapons, because they both see it as their trump card in order to dictate terms to the rest of the world. I'll go into a political example here. Iran was a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They want to have nuclear reactors for power, and that is where the West said no, and Iran said, what do you mean no? We're not building weapons with it. We're trying to make power plants with it. oh, but you could easily convert those power plants to be heavy water reactors. And Iran said, only if you piss us off. But that's not what they're doing now. And as they got pissed off by the West and its sanctions, they did that. But that's not what those original reactors were for. Basically, Iran said, why are you bothering us? You don't like us for whatever reason. You don't like our government form. You don't like our religion. You don't like the color of our skin. But we're not building reactors to build bombs until you provoke us into doing that. And so we ended up in that situation. But the non-proliferation treaty, Ukraine signed it when they became an independent state. They used to house a ton of Soviet missiles. And as in exchange for giving those missiles back to Russia, which Russia was legally entitled to as the inheritor of all credits and debts of the Soviet Union, they got a piece of paper from Russia that said, we'll never bother you again if you give us all those missiles back. Well, let's see how well that worked out. So no, Rex, I don't think that we end up in a place where nuclear weapons are gone because the world is abhorred by the concept of their use. I think the more likely outcome is we develop a technology that makes them irrelevant, where the ability to launch an intercontinental nuclear ballistic salvo is negated. Yeah, Doc's right too. Don't get your news from one source. I routinely, I don't watch television because television is not objective in any form anymore. I do listen to the BBC World Service. I read the Washington Post, which I have a subscription to. I read NPR. And then I tend to make sure I read center or center-left leaning newspapers internationally. The Guardian is a great one in the UK, by the way. I mean, Star Wars isn't Star Wars isn't gonna work. But there's the potential for technologies that will, missile shields are where we are now, and they are not universally useful. But who knows what the future holds with the ability to effectively make a warhead inert via some sort of broadcast hack to the inbound weapons. I mean, there's all kinds of ideas. There's Star Trek stuff, right? But I don't think we have to get to that point. The point of the question, I guess, or the answer is, Rex was saying, do we think we end up in a non-nuclear world? No, I don't think we do. There's a thing called the Great Filter, where society has to pass through this concept of a great filter where they realize they have created the ability to annihilate themselves and dismantle that ability and never return to it. And that is how a civilization evolves. It is the step we're at right now in the evolution of philosophical civics. And we're nowhere near the high-minded, enlightened thinking that is necessary to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't have those anymore, because I agree with Rocket. I won't see it in my lifetime, because humanity as a concept is always superseded by the state which is controlling the resources generated by humanity. And as long as it's in someone's interest to maintain a weapon of destruction to solidify their power base, I don't think it's going away. Yeah, innovation comes up with the weirdest crap all the time. There's another great, those of you playing Horizon Forbidden West have also probably heard the phrase, every defensive mechanism has always been overcome by an offensive mechanism, which is true. So there will become, at some point, a defensive mechanism that supersedes nuclear warfare, and then we'll take a next step. We'll either take a next step, or we'll go, whoa, it's a nice peaceful world we have now. Maybe we shouldn't go any further. But World War I, when we get to it, you'll hear about how the Tsar of Russia, to stay on topic, wished to limit the production of things like battleships or dreadnoughts at the time. He wanted to limit the size of armies that a nation could deploy. And here he was, the possessor of the largest potential infantry in the world. He was trying to limit that in the run-up to World War I. And the rest of the world pretty much laughed at him, because they're like, all that means is you're weak. You want to put limits in because you can't even meet those limits, and we can. Obviously, this is the time to do something about you. That was the reaction of the world. But anyway, hour and 15 minutes now on this one. I think unless you guys have anything else you wish to cover within the Ukraine conversation, again, the intent was to just kind of bring it all together, put all the concepts and ideas and stuff that's floating around there on the table. I knew the economic thing was something that most people didn't get because it's complicated. You know, the idea that there is a solvency of currency necessary for business exchange between nations, and that's what's being attacked primarily by all of this. I knew that was something that was primarily in the mind of everyone else. And you guys know me. I don't watch television. I sit down and I read, and I try to break down the pieces of everything so I understand how it all assembles together. And I didn't learn about how sweeping and reaching these economic sanctions were and why until the last, I would say, 10 days, because I wanted to be able to then in turn come to this forum and say, let me put it to you in terms that will make sense so that you know why this is effective. Again, thank you very much, Gilly. Hold off on gift subs and bits if you don't mind. I would much rather you click one of those links that's in the chat right now and give money directly to institutions that need it in Ukraine. We just donated $175 yesterday to the Ukrainian Red Cross. That's all sourced from your bits and subs of the past 2 months. We're going to send March's money there as well. So thank you all for hanging out tonight. I know listening to Fix Talk at length for some can be, ad nauseum boring. I also felt this is necessary. I felt that I needed to put information forward because I'm in a position where I could do so, and I had the setup in order to present it to others. So I appreciate your time. Too, if you go back and watch 31 episodes of Heavy Metal History, you got plenty on your plate, buddy. But thank you for your time tonight. Thank you for paying attention to what is going on and for caring about it enough to sit here and hang out with all of us. But yeah, I think in the absence of any further comments or questions, we'll call it a night. We'll get out of here with our normal stuff. We'll try to find someone to raid real quick. And yeah, let me go see who's out there in Twitch land real quick. My friend Ozzy is playing Elden Ring. I was hanging out with him earlier, and I haven't raided him in a while, so I'm going to go send you guys over there. Ozzy in space. He is a genuinely nice guy, and he's in the late stage of Elden. I would say second zone of Elden Ring if you're looking for spoiler avoidance. It's good to see you too, Toofy. I was glad to see you pop in a Discord the other day as well, and I'm happy to see you back in here. So support Ukraine how you can, whether that be with just shooting down idiocy or, making sure that we do what we can as a community to support people there, because we can't go fight. I mean, just none of us can. But let's get out of here. Don't forget my good friend Odd Dustin. You won't see it on the screen because something's wrong with the overlay, but make sure you go say hi to Dustin Monday through Friday, 7:30 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. He's playing a mix of Horizon Forbidden West and Elden Ring. Then go hang out with Perm after that, Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. He was playing the end of Zero Dawn, I think, getting ready for Forbidden West. Then there is Gilly, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Sunday nights. I think he's getting ready for Forbidden West as well. Make sure to make fun of Dustin's aiming skills. Thank you very much, Rex. And then make sure you hang out with Rocket Tuesdays, Thursdays. She's playing Forbidden West as well. And then I think she's still playing Tomb Raider on the weekends, but she did not go this morning. Hopefully you feel better tomorrow. She's going tomorrow. Tomorrow morning with Rocket. That's right. And then CF Live, he's done music for our stream. Thank you very much, CF, as always, my good friend. Make sure you give him a follow. He rocks out for sure on Wednesdays and Fridays during the daytime. And then Diggity as well. Did some more music, plays games with other people. I'm out of here. You guys have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you very much for your time and attention as always tonight. And I'll talk to you all next week.
Be excellent to each other.